Hey guys, the purpose of this video is to walk you through Vygotsky, and he is the theorist of the sociocultural constructivism. Piaget was more cognitive individual constructivism, and Vygotsky is the social cultural. He really emphasizes the aspect of the social aspect of learning and the cultural aspect of learning. I love this quote here on the first slide. What a child can do today with assistance, she will be able to do by herself tomorrow. Our objectives by the end of this presentation and by the time we have finished discussing Vygotsky in review next week, you should be able to say that you understand what a community of learners is and that you have strategies for creating one, including cognitive apprentices. I can list direct applications, classroom applications of Vygotsky's theory. I can explain with accurate, precise examples Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and how it impacts the classroom, including its impact on flexible grouping. And then I can provide several grouping strategies with benefits of each strategy. So Vygotsky's social cultural constructivism. I just want to remind you that constructivists believe that learners construct or create or build their knowledge. Now, Piaget and Vygotsky are both constructivists, but Piaget is more an individual cognitive constructivist. Vygotsky emphasized, like I said a minute ago, the more social aspect and the impact of culture itself. Now, Vygotsky followed Piaget in the development of the theories. Piaget was first, and then Vygotsky. And Vygotsky died at a very young age. I want to say he was like 37 or 38 of tuberculosis. So he never really finished fully developing his theory. Other researchers have since carried it on and kind of finished fleshing it out. But what we study of Vygotsky was what he did accomplish before he passed away. And he felt, they both agreed with a lot of the basics. You'll see that later on in this presentation. But Vygotsky felt that the stages that we learned about with Piaget, those 4 different stages, that they were not necessarily natural for all children, because Piaget, like many of the other theorists have suggested, Piaget underemphasized the role of cultural and the way that culture impacts our students and us individually. Vygotsky really understood that, what Piaget was seeing was really pretty relative to Western cultures, but not so much to every child. So today we recognize, of course, that culture shapes our cognitive development. Culture shapes everything about us. For those of you guys who have had the first TESOL course, 3081C, you may remember how much culture can impact and affect your decisions, your thoughts, your perceptions, what we choose to pay attention to, all of that. So like cultures that prize cooperation and sharing will teach those same abilities early. Cultures that really emphasize hard work and determination emphasize that at a very young age, or independence, they emphasize at a very young age. Likewise, cultures that encourage competition nurture competitive skills in their very, very young children. So what children come in your classroom with already, what kind of experiences they've had, may, at least according to Vygotsky, be impacted by the cultures from which they come. Vygotsky also believed that human activities that take place in cultural settings, that every setting we are in is impacted by culture specifically. Small, brief example just to kind of show the point here. But you think about here in the South, you go to a restaurant and you will hear many people ordering sweet tea. It would be completely unheard of for a restaurant here in this area to be like, we're out of sweet tea. Yet you go to, let's say, Eastern Kentucky, which is technically still part of the South. However, they're close enough to the North that they've been impacted some. The culture is different. And you can ask for sweet tea, and they might say, sorry, we're out of it. We ran out of sugar a week ago. And nobody ran to the store right behind this restaurant to go get more sugar. It's not a big deal. If that happened here, if you ran out of sugar at a local restaurant here, somebody would be taking themselves a trip to the store to buy some more sugar. You just don't run out of it. We were in Louisiana a couple weeks ago, and they didn't even serve sweet tea at all. It was only unsweetened. There's sugar on the table. That's just not at all, that wouldn't fly here. It's a cultural thing. And that's, like I said, a very, very small example. But Vygotsky believed that every activity that we're involved in takes place in some kind of cultural setting, and we cannot separate culture from every setting. One of his key ideas was that our specific mental structures and processes, the way that you specifically process and think, can be traced to our interactions with other people. Think about times that you have been with another person and you've picked up some of their mannerisms, or you've picked up some of their ways of thinking. You've had discussions with others and they've helped you change your mind about something, or you begin to say certain phrases and somebody says, well, where did you get that? You see this a lot even in your own small children. They mimic you because of what they have seen. And Vygotsky would attribute this to our interactions with other affecting our mental structure. Of course, we learned a couple weeks ago, Bandura would attribute that same exact situation to modeling and vicarious learning. So again, all these theorists are basically looking at the same kind of situations and trying to explain them with different approaches. Vygotsky believes that social interactions actually create our cognitive structures and thinking processes. So, like, Vygotsky believes that we learn through our cultural settings, and that increases our cognitive development. Piaget says that we have cognitive development first, and then we can learn. Vygotsky says learning is first, and then cognitive development. Piaget reverses that order. So here are some key principles of Vygotsky. He, like somebody else we know, Piaget, believed that children do undergo developmental transitions in their thinking, and not necessarily, he didn't call them specific stages. He didn't say that Piaget stages were wrong, or he disagreed with him. In fact, he agreed that at the same kind of breaks in childhood development that Piaget noted, Vygotsky agreed that there's definitely a developmental transition around those times. And so he does agree that there's some kind of developmental stage action going on here. Vygotsky also believed that it's through both informal interactions and formal schooling that adults convey to children ideal methods for interpreting the world. So in other words, the things that we do with children, the things that we share, the experiences that we have with them, while we're having those experiences, we provide meaning and we help them to attach meaning to the specific objects and events. When we do that, we're actually creating situations that children now actually have transformed, that they've adapted our meanings in that same situation to become theirs. We are helping them make sense of the experiences, and that's called mediation. So if we go to the Gulfarium, and my children have never, my children have been to the Gulfarium a bunch of times, but let's say the very first time that we go to the Gulfarium, my children have never seen dolphins, they've never seen them jumping out of the water and hitting a ball, and I help them while we're there know what to expect, and then I explain what's happened, and did you see that dolphin leap out of the water like that, and he was pushing his tail to give him the power to jump out of the water. Like, I'm helping them to attach meanings to the event that they're in. They're transforming, according to Vygotsky, the situation we're experiencing and what I'm helping them to understand into their own learning and their own development. And that is called mediation. I'm helping them make sense of the experience. Every culture, according to Vygotsky, passes along physical and cognitive tools that make daily living more efficient. If you have an individual who's coming from a very developed nation, they may be very familiar with technology and how to use it, how to use a smartphone, how to swipe, a touchscreen, all of that. If you have an individual who's coming from more of a migrant farmer type background, they may be very familiar with different farming tools and techniques and the things that you have to know to be able to do that job and to live in that kind of culture. So we pass along, based on the way that we live and the way that our culture impacts our lives, we pass along very specific physical and cognitive tools. Vygotsky also suggests that thought and language development are increasingly interdependent, meaning relying on each other those first few years. So one of the key things that Vygotsky means when he's talking about this is he's talking about this notion of self-talk, which is also called private speech. Both of those terms mean the same thing. Self-talk and private speech. How many of you guys have ever talked to yourself, or in a difficult problem, if you can just kind of shut out all the other noise, you kind of talk yourself mentally inside your head and be internal speech, or if you physically actually talk out loud to yourself, it's self-talk and private speech, kind of walking yourself through the process and through the steps that you need to take. That is what Vygotsky is talking about. And we see a lot of children do this. Sometimes I'll even watch, I have a 4-year-old son, and as he's playing with blocks and that kind of stuff, and I'll hear him saying, okay, I'm going to put this one here, and then watch, if I put it on top of this one, I bet the tower's going to, it fell. And he's talking through the entire process. That is self-talk. That's private speech. And it actually, the language and the thought process work together and become increasingly more interdependent, and it actually leads to cognitive development. interesting for the classroom, especially if you're teaching younger children, even through 2nd and 3rd grade, that sometimes when we see individuals stuck on a problem, they kind of will plug their ears. I even still do this as an adult, y'all. Plug my ears, and your children will do this, and they kind of start talking themselves mentally or out loud through the problem, step by step, what they're supposed to do. This is an actual real developmental strategy, and it's really important for us to encourage in the students who rely on it. Complex mental processes begin as social activities, according to Vygotsky, and then they gradually evolve into more internal mental processes. So in other words, start out something as a very difficult mental process, begin in a social activity, even if it's teacher to student kind of social interaction, and slowly but surely it becomes an internal mental process through something called internalization. Now, Vygotsky calls it exactly this right here. Bandura would call this modeling. He would call this whole situation where I take something that's complex and I model it and I demonstrate it and I involve students in that modeling process, and then they eventually internalize that. Vygotsky's same principle here, just calling it something different from what Bandura called it, but it's exactly the same idea. Social interaction, social dependence first, and then we begin to internalize that. This relates directly to that I do, we do, you do kind of aspect as well. Another principle of Vygotsky is that each child acquires a culture's tools in an individual manner. So just because they're from the same culture doesn't mean that every child's coming in exactly the same way. You're not going to have 2 Hispanic children come in and they're both exactly identical in the way that the strategies they have, their development, their understanding. They're still going to acquire those tools and that background individually based on the strategies that they have, the exposure that they've had, their background knowledge, which Vygotsky doesn't call it schema. He doesn't call it background knowledge. He calls it their prior understandings, but it's the same exact principle. He says our motivations, the way that we personally are creative or not creative, our perception of things. So again, he doesn't call it perception. It's exactly the same idea. The way we transform ideas, we all do that individually. Even, no 2 people are going to look at the exact same situation and see 100% the same thing because of what we bring from our culture and from our experiences. Vygotsky also says, this might sound familiar as well, that children can perform more challenging tasks when they are assisted by advanced helpers. And he's talking about something called cognitive apprentices. And this is, think about what an apprentice is. In the old days, an apprentice was somebody who studied under a master. So let's say that we had somebody who was a really awesome basket weaver. And this person who was the basket weaver would have apprentices who would be studying under this basket weaver and would learn the skill and the trade. The same thing can happen here, according to Vygotsky, if we use cognitive apprentices, where we have, in most cases, it's an adult or a teacher. Could be an older student working as a peer mentor. It could be actually somebody in the class who's already mastered certain skills and concepts, kind of working almost like a tutor, but they're modeling that thinking process behind it. And as they do that, it leads to further development for the children. So Vygotsky emphasized this whole pushing children to more difficult tasks at the upper end of their zone of proximal development to increase their cognitive development. The harder the task, the more likely they are to increase, as long as the task is not frustrating and beyond their reach and their grasp. Piaget would call this disequilibrium. We get them to disequilibrium, it pushes them to think, to process, to learn, and they get back to equilibrium. So it's the same basic concept, but they're calling it something different. And whereas Piaget, it was more, each individual at their disequilibrium. Vygotsky says we're going to put them into this challenging situation, and then we're going to offer them support through that social interaction, whether it's with a teacher, a peer, a mentor, some kind of classroom assistant, some other adult. Some kind of social support is going to be provided for them in Vygotsky's approach to get them to that higher level of thinking. So let's talk about this zone of proximal development. Many of you guys have mentioned ZPD before, so I know that you guys have some background knowledge about zone of proximal development, but let's talk about what it really is. So basically every individual, for every aspect, for their spelling, for their writing, for their reading, for their math skills, for their social science understanding, for their science itself understanding, not just social studies, for every academic content area, we have these different levels of development that we're in. We have these different stages of development. We'll talk a lot about those different stages of development when we get a little bit later, right before the end of the semester. But Vygotsky calls this their zone of proximal development. So an example that many of you are probably familiar with, let's talk about reading. So we have this program in most of our local schools called Accelerated Reader. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. An Accelerated Reader, students take a STAR test, and it's kind of like a placement. It is a placement test that actually gives them their zone of proximal development. And it even literally says zone of proximal development on the report. It's kind of cool. When you see it, you're like, I know that's Vygotsky. You feel like you've really accomplished something for the day. So you look at this and it says their range, their reading range. And what that zone is, or that range, it's the level at which, on the lower end, the level at which a child should be able to read a text and function and comprehend independently without any support. Then you get into that middle to high range right there, and that is the level at which the child can read and understand, but may need a little tiny bit of assistance and support to get them to that next level, to push them up. Okay, so for example, if my daughter brings home a STAR test and it says on there that she's on a 2.6 to a 3.2, and then it'll say individual or independent reading level or instructional reading level, and it'll say 2.9. So 2.6 to 3.2 with an individual reading level of a 2.9. And you're going, okay, too many numbers at once. Remember that 2.6 means the 2 means second grade, and the 0.6 means the 6th month of second grade. 2.9 would be the 9th month of second grade. 3.0 would be 3rd grade, okay? Or 3.2, 3rd grade, 2nd month. And so she's on this 2.9 independent, but she could read as low as 2.6, those books as low as 2.6, and it'd be at her fully independent level. She doesn't need any kind of assistance and support whatsoever. If she's reading books that are about a 2.9, then it means they're going to be a little bit of a challenge for her, and she may have a couple of questions occasionally. There may be like, a word or two in each book that she's like, I have no idea what this means, and she may need a tad bit of support. If she's reading at that highest level, those 3.2 levels, then that's the top of the level where we feel comfortable with her reading completely independently. So if I have this text and it's a 3.4 and it's above her zone of proximal development, I know I have to offer her a greater level of support than I would if the text were a 2.6 text or a 2.9 even, okay? Same thing happens with accelerated math. It gives us a range of where our students fall in their math skills, and it starts them on specific lessons and goes from there. You also will see this, I've seen a lot of schools using this, where teachers will conduct, and you see this in DRA assessments if you've done those, or they'll do like a fluency and comprehension assessment. And with that fluency assessment, we look at their rate, their accuracy, what kind of cueing systems they're using, and then we also will look to see their comprehension. It doesn't matter if they read 120 words a minute if they didn't comprehend squat. So we have to factor in that comprehension. And we get their zone of proximal development, their reading range based off of that. And so we might find out that a student's independent level is a guided reading level K. Some of you guys know totally what I'm talking about, and some of you guys are completely clueless by that. But we'll say a K is about equivalent to, let's say, a 2.6 on AR. So 2nd grade, 6th month. And then we'll say that their instructional level, the level at which they need that support, might be a level L. And then their frustration level, which we don't want to push them to that frustration level and shut them down. Anything that's at a level N or above, we're going to say that's frustration level. So we're not going to ask them to read that text individually. Not at all. But we would pull them for guided reading groups, and we would give them probably a level L or maybe a level M text to start with, but we're not going to push them all the way to an N. Not yet. It's frustration level. Okay. We may, if it's a really hard skill, we may let them read a level K text that they can read independently so we can focus strictly on the skill itself. This is application of the zone of proximal development, okay? We've got to look at their independent level, which is the low end of the zone, their instructional level, which is pretty much the middle where we're targeting for that middle range, and then the high end. We will use this zone of proximal development when we're doing flexible grouping, when we're putting students, we're pulling them for guided reading groups, and we're trying to see what kind of text I need to have for them. We'll use zone of proximal development when I'm pulling math groups or when I'm making math stations and I want to make sure that everybody's getting exactly what they need. This zone of proximal development always tells me where I need to hit each student individually, instructionally. How to make my instructional plans for the students based on where they are developmentally. I don't always want them in their independent. I want them in their instructional range so I can push them to the next level. It's kind of getting them to that stage of disequilibrium in Piaget, but we're pushing them to the, in Vygotsky, to the higher level in their zone of proximal development. I hope that made sense to you, because it totally made sense to me, but not sure that came out right. So if you have questions, email me, let me know. Vygotsky's, another one of Vygotsky's key principles is that challenging tasks promote maximum cognitive growth. We just talked about that. Same idea as disequilibrium and Piaget. And I also like this one. It lines right up with Piaget, is that play allows children to stretch themselves cognitively, especially when we provide real life reflective tools for them to play with. For example, we provide little play kitchens of measuring cups, and we let them play with measuring cups in the sand station and in the water station, and we give them beans and they have to measure and play with those with spoons and bowls, and they see how bowls of different shapes actually can hold the same amount. That's conservation, which Piaget talked about. Play stretches individuals cognitively, and yet we don't let them play enough. Something to think about. So Vygotsky's his social interaction, he says, was more than just influence. He says that social interaction is actually the very beginning of those higher mental processes like problem solving, that it's through social interaction, and then he says through co-construction that we have this higher level process developing. So between a child and another person, whether it's the teacher, somebody modeling, a cognitive mentor, so that the individual is a cognitive apprentice, through an individual and somebody else, we co-construct through shared activities this beginning of a mental process. And then that process is internalized by the child, and it actually forces cognitive development. So in other words, modeling. Basically, it boils down to modeling. I want you to think for yourself about how these two really relate to each other, modeling and co-construction. But think about how it's shared between the child and another person. And through that, the child has to process, internalize, and then that creates cognitive development. How is that reflective of modeling? You don't have to write anything out for that, but I would love for you to pause, reflect on what you've done so far, reflect on what I've learned, jot down a couple of notes. If you're looking at it, your blank piece of paper and going, I can't remember squat that she just said, something about modeling, pause it, go back through the slides, rewind the video, whatever you need to do. Make sure you're good up to this point. And again, you're not turning in. This isn't one of the reflection questions, just something to think about. How co-construction in Vygotsky is similar to Bandura's modeling. Okay, so if you've hit play again now, Vygotsky believed that language and then that private speech, remember this was talking to yourself, guides that cognitive development. And so if we allow students to use language, whether it's talking with a peer or with themselves, it's still the use of language, that this helps them to actually direct their attention, solve problems, form concepts, actually do some planning, and that this is such an important part. So we have to let individuals, children and even adults, actually have that private speech. Now, most of the time, adults do this mentally, internally. They don't actually sit there and say things out loud. Some individuals do. I do at times, depending upon who I'm around and what the situation is. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. But a lot of times we use private speech when we're confused, when we're having difficulties, when we're making mistakes, and we're trying to kind of backtrack a little bit. You know, somebody you might hear them say, well, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. That's private speech, okay? That's also self-monitoring and self-regulation. They realize that something doesn't make sense. And so they kind of backtrack and start trying to figure it out. A lot of times they'll talk themselves through it. This is that private speech. Vygotsky highly recommends teaching children how to use private speech, modeling that for them, and then allowing, of course, opportunities for everybody to use it. It helps them to regulate their thinking. Pretty much just said all of this. Implication, think alouds. Use think alouds. Show individuals in your modeling why you did what you did in that mathematics problem. Why did you carry the one, or we don't call it carrying anymore. Why did you regroup the one? Or why did you regroup to put more across that zero so you can subtract? Why do you do the things that we do, and what's the actual thinking process behind the actions that you're taking and that you're teaching them to take? Same thing with reading or in writing. I'm writing along and I write the word big and then I cross it out and I write enormous above it. And I need to say to them, you know what, big is an okay word, but I want to use really good word choice. And I want to make sure that my students, or my readers are getting the best picture possible. And big paints one picture, but enormous paints a much better picture. So I'm going to change the word big to enormous. It's a better word choice. And as I give them that language, I'm modeling for them that think a lot. I'm also giving them private speech that will increase their cognitive development as well. So another suggestion of Vygotsky, this isn't one of his prime principles, but is definitely something that comes out of there, is using guided and assisted learning, not just self-discovery. We don't just provide these situations. Montessori would disagree with him here, but we don't just provide these situations and say, okay, go experience and learn. Vygotsky is different from Piaget in that Piaget would a little bit create more of these guided discovery or discovery-based learning. And Vygotsky isn't against them, but he says we don't want just self-discovery. We want guided discovery and assisted learning based on students' levels and needs, which is the zone of proximal development. Vygotsky suggests that we need to remind our students the information that's given. We need to prompt them. We need to give them reminders of what they're supposed to be doing. And we need to give them encouragement at the right times. Very, very simple way to do this. You give an assignment. You tell students to do these 3 things in this order. Turn around and write them on the board. It takes 2 seconds, and yet as students go from one task to the next, and some students will forget what they were supposed to be doing, reduce that extraneous cognitive load for them and have it on the board so they can just look back at what they're supposed to do. It's a very simple reminder. It's right up there. It's no problem. And it's a great strategy. Teachers, according to Vygotsky, in this guided discovery and assisted learning, they would adapt materials and the problems to students' current levels. That relates directly to the ZPD. We would scaffold, demonstrate skills and their thought processes, which is modeling, provide detailed feedback, allow for revisions of their work and of their thinking processes, ask questions that reinforce skills, and help students to refocus their attention. So Vygotsky versus Piaget. Let's look at the two kind of almost side by side and see what's similar and what's different. Now, I'm not going to ask you for this in your reflection questions, but it would not be, hint, hint, final exam, would not be a bad idea for you to kind of create a little either Venn diagram or a double T chart, some way to organize Vygotsky on one side, Piaget on the other, what's different and what's similar. I kind of have them all mixed up in here, so you actually have to think and pull them apart. But Piaget and Vygotsky both emphasize the importance of social interaction and cognitive development. However, for Piaget, it wasn't nearly as important as it was for Vygotsky. Vygotsky really said we have to have the social interaction first, and then we can get to cognitive development. Whether that social interaction is adult to individual or peer to peer, doesn't matter. But Vygotsky says we have to have that social interaction first. And Piaget said it has to be there, but it doesn't have to be the prime thing. Both of the individuals emphasize the critical role of play in early development. Piaget believed that social interaction encouraged development by creating that disequilibrium that we've talked about. Vygotsky views social interaction as the very basis for creating and internalizing knowledge. What we can do with a student today with a little bit of assistance, that social interaction, the child can do by his or herself tomorrow. Vygotsky did also emphasize challenging problems to lead to further cognitive development, which would be in Piaget, his version of disequilibrium. Piaget believed that the most helpful interactions were between peers, and Vygotsky suggested that it has to be somebody who is more cognitively advanced, which would be like parents, teachers, cognitive mentors. Students in the classroom have already mastered these skills, not just direct peers. Vygotsky believed that cultural tools play a very important role. We bring all kinds of specific tools based on our culture. Piaget didn't acknowledge any of that. Piaget did say the culture has a role, but he underestimated it completely. Vygotsky emphasized zone of proximal development, which we know is that range ability where they can function independently, instructional to frustration. And Piaget suggested there are 4 specific stages of cognitive development. Now, do keep in mind, though, Vygotsky does say, yeah, there is some development that occurs in transitional stages. He just didn't label them or call them anything specific like Piaget did. Vygotsky sees learning as a tool in development. Learning actually pulls our development to higher levels. So we're developing, and then learning kind of helps us to develop. But Piaget viewed learning as a result of cognitive development. He says we're developing cognitively, and because we're developing, then we can learn. But Vygotsky said, no, learning actually helps us to develop. If we don't learn, we don't develop cognitively. Both of them emphasize organization of the material that we're learning and how we store it in our processes. Both of them suggested that at any one given time, a child is cognitively ready for some experiences, but not for others. And they both also acknowledge that the brain maturation places limits on what a child can do. Some tasks are just not what children can do at this point in time. My daughter is a dancer and for Catherine's studio in Crestview. And Catherine was talking about the lead lady, the coach. She was talking about at a certain age, I think they have to be like 13 before they can do a certain kind of dance. And we're at this parent meeting, and one of the parents said, well, why? My child loves that kind of dance when she watches it. Why don't you have a class for the younger kids in that? And she made the point that their brains and their bodies just simply the brains don't process those movements yet, and their bodies younger than 13 simply can't physically move in that way. And I thought of that example as soon as I was reading through Vygotsky again and kind of refreshing myself about how our maturation places limits. Either we're ready for certain things or we've passed, developmental points, things like that. Both Piaget and Vygotsky suggest that children are always ready to learn something. Piaget says, though, that it's because they're naturally curious. Vygotsky says that it's because they're wanting to learn skills and concepts that they see used in their culture, whether it's their home or their community. Piaget, obviously, like we've said multiple times, is more individual, whereas Vygotsky is more social. So let's talk a couple of implications of Vygotsky for the classroom. So Piaget taught us that we can learn a great deal by thinking about how children actually think, listening to how they're solving the problems, the why of what they're doing. And then if we understand children's thinking, we'll be better able to match our teaching to the way that they're currently thinking. Vygotsky calls this zone of proximal development. Vygotsky says we've got to teach specific cognitive tools needed in academic disciplines. So if we are culturally, which we are here, in a place that emphasizes reading and mathematics, then we've got to provide them cognitive tools to be able to read and comprehend any kind of text and to be able to form basic mathematical skills. We've got to teach them those basic cognitive tools before they can move forward into more complex processes. He also suggests that because of his research, we realize that we need to do group learning activities that help them to internalize specific strategies. So we can do reciprocal teaching or peer teaching. Stop, teach your partner about blah, 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 blah. Stop and explain to your partner how to do the FOIL method or whatever concept you're working at the time. Stop and turn to your buddy. I want you to explain the water cycle process. And then, so they explain the water cycle and say, okay, now trade, something like that. Utilize think, pair, share. Elbow buddies, small group cooperative settings, literature circles. I have no idea why there's this random apostrophe there because there certainly shouldn't be. So ignore the fact that there's an apostrophe there on literature circles. I think it just got there all by itself. Implications of Vygotsky would also be that we need to provide tangible and visual reminders of what children should actually be doing. Like we talked about, and for those of you guys who are in the face-to-face class, we talked about a couple weeks ago about how we don't want to call them centers unless we're in early childhood, like before kindergarten. Because in centers, that just means that they're supposed to play, but we want to call them workstations, the simple title. And we would put pictures of what the child's supposed to be doing there. They're not supposed to be throwing the blocks. So we put a picture of the child building the blocks, something like that. Now, obviously, at the older grades, it's not going to be so much a reminder and a picture form of what to do there, but you could have a picture in the form of a sample of what it should look like when it's done, or how they should get started, or step-by-step checklist of what they need to make sure they do. That would be sufficient for older grades. This would also be a great application would be the writing the page number on the board. I want you to turn to page 742 in your textbook. That's a huge textbook if it has 742 pages. Sorry, it was first never came to mind. But you would write the page number on the board. So as they're getting their stuff out and somebody was in the bathroom and they're looking for a pencil and yada, 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 the page number's on the board. You don't have to say it 854 times. I might use hyperbole for the point of emphasis. Sorry. Provide effective scaffolding, meeting that challenge for those who need it, providing the supports along the way for the children who need those supports. Notice it never says anything about changing or lowering your expectations. Everything is about meeting their needs and providing the support that they need to meet the higher expectations. Encourage and allow self-talk, model think alouds. And I love this one, so applicable in today's world, unfortunately not followed well enough. Assess children's abilities under a variety of work conditions. Don't just use a pencil paper snapshot and that's it. Don't base your evaluation of their cognitive ability or their cognitive development strictly on one snapshot. No one snapshot tells the whole story. And the reason I said it's not really followed well enough in today's day and time is we can base promotion and retention off of standardized test scores. Now, granted, those aren't taken just in one day, but it's still a single snapshot. That may bother me a little bit. Allow children to play, both free play and constructed play. Differentiate, goes with zone of proximal development. Flexible grouping. Now let's talk a little bit more about flexible grouping for just a minute. You're going to dig into flexible grouping some on your own, but what I want to kind of hammer in on this flexible grouping is it is literally what it says, flexible groups. And so let's say, for example, in guided reading, that I'm wanting to work to push my readers to the next level. Well, I cannot have a group for guided reading in which I have a child reading on a 6.2 level, a child reading on a 4.5 level, and another child reading on a 2.2 level. It just doesn't make sense because I cannot have a single text that meets all of their needs for me to do in a guided reading group when I have that wide. So for this specific skill, or the specific reading strategies that I'm wanting to teach, I need to have children in a group that are all about on the same reading level within, a couple of little points there so that I can create one text or I can pull one text for us to work together on. Well, let's say that tomorrow I need to work on main idea because I've got like 6 students across all different reading levels who are really struggling with main idea. So I'm going to pull a grade level text regardless of how high some of my other kids are reading, and I'm going to focus on main idea. I'm doing skill work. And so that group is totally different than when I was doing strategy work for them as they're decoding or as they're, working on comprehension specifically, something like that. And then let's say in my math groups, I have several students who just start getting word problems. And so I'm going to pull a different group there. Flexible grouping. Sometimes it's based on ability. Sometimes it's based on need. It's based on strengths and weaknesses. And I'm not going to pull some of my stronger kids into my group of lower kids because they need to be working and challenging themselves and pushing themselves forward. But sometimes they're not going to have all the skills. And so they might be pulled into that lower group. And these groups are ever flexible and ever changing. That's why they're called flexible grouping. Provide opportunities to engage in authentic activities, project-based learning, meaningful tasks, real-world application, not just add and subtract fractions. Instead, how about we convert a recipe, something that's going to be a real-world application. A couple of videos that I want you guys to watch. That kind of sums up some of the implications. There are many, many more implications of Vygotsky, but that's quite a huge number to kind of process and deal with there. So on this PowerPoint will be loaded onto D2L as well. And I've discovered that when I play videos and try to record the sound through this video, the sound for a lot of you guys just isn't good. So I'm not going to try to play the video, but these videos are not super long. I mean, really, in about 15 minutes, you can watch all the videos. There's some on the next slide too. But please, please, please take the time to really watch these videos. They're all from the teaching channel, which is fantastic. I encourage you, if you ever just get bored, like you have time to be bored, but if you just want to watch some really good, challenging videos that are really good demonstrations of classrooms that are doing things well, go on teaching channel and just start searching. There's so many amazing videos. But just watch some of these. This first one here, all of these videos I'm having a look at right now deal with cooperative grouping and discussions and things of that nature. But this first one, there's one aspect where the lady talks about how she used test scores to group her students, and she called them the gold, the bronze, and the silver group. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that particular thing because I think that would kind of set some of our students up for some negative feelings. And we call them the bronze group, and they know only the dummies got into the bronze group kind of deal. She actually based it on test scores and allows competition and all that. So caution about that. Excuse me. But to each his own, and you make your personal theory on how to teach and learn, but just something to point out and think about. But please watch these videos here and then the ones on this slide as well. So there are a total of 7 videos, but none of them are longer than like 2.5 or maybe at most 3 minutes. So they're not that long. Highly encourage you to watch each of these videos and jot down some notes for yourself about the important things there. Several of these videos also talk about this one right here, collaboration versus cooperative learning. Very, very good video that really hammers in how we create this, getting students to talk meaningfully with each other. And the one up here is the community of learners and what it means to have a community of learners. We talked, those of you guys from face-to-face class, remember we talked about having students respect each other and how to agree and disagree. These are all aspects of a community of learners that are really, really important. So again, your objectives, read through these, make sure you can say, yeah, I can actually do this. Some of the community of learners we will hit more in the classroom and in next week's video for those of you guys that are online. And then the rest of these you should have, specifically this one right here, this last one, you're going to hit in this week's reflective questions, which are here. First question, I want you to explain the zone of proximal development. Explain what it is, the role of assessment in the zone of proximal development, and then how understanding your students' zones will actually impact your instructional decisions. I want at least 2 specific examples of how understanding ZPD will impact your instruction. Give me 2 clear examples there. I want you to list 3 ways to form cooperative groups, which means you're going to have to go do a little bit of research, Google ways to group students, and I want you to give me at least 3 ways. You can go onto Pinterest and find a lot of them. For example, the other day in the face-to-face class, I gave you guys color cards and I said, or numbers. I gave you guys numbers. All the number 1s are at this table, all the number 2s at this table, so on and so forth. You could do color cards and say all of the reds at this table, all of the greens at this table. If you were to only do 2 groups, I would never suggest that you hand out white and black. Do not say all of my white over here, all of my black over here. There are so many other color sheets of paper that you could use. There have actually been situations where teachers just really, truly thought nothing of it. I wouldn't have thought anything of it because that would never have crossed my mind. But students took offense to that, and then it created a big problem for the teacher that really could have been avoided by simply thinking a little bit more culturally sensitive and just use 2 different color sheets of paper. Use green and teal. It really doesn't matter. You can use 5 different colors or whatever. So give me some ways to form cooperative groups. And then the last question is probably the one that's going to take you the most time, but it shouldn't be, like an essay or anything like that. But I want you to describe. You can use it in the form of a story, a cartoon using toondoo.com. It's free. Or a labeled illustration that you draw. Break out your colored pencils, draw me a fabulous picture, and then add your labels and explain it. But I want you to show me what a safe, productive community of learners looks like or sounds like or feels like if you write a story or do a cartoon or you do a labeled illustration. One of those 3 methods, but it has to show me a safe, productive community of learners. Include the students and the teacher and their specific roles and what's going on. Okay, so those are your 3 reflective questions for this week's video. I look forward to working with you guys next week.